This is the MyHeart.net podcast. This show is produced by Dr. Philip Johnson in conjunction with VitalEngine.com. Please welcome your host, Dr. Alain Bouchard, cardiologist at UAB St. Vincent's.
So welcome back to MyHeart.net, the show where we break down the science of cardiovascular care into something you can use, whether you're nearly diagnosed with cardiovascular disease or managing your condition or just trying to stay a step ahead. I'm your host, Alain Bouchard, and we're diving into something that surprises a lot of people. Ultra-processed food surpasses tobacco as the leading cause of early death. What we know is that from the 70s to 2000, cardiovascular mortality declined steadily in the U.S., and this was due to reduction in smoking rates, widespread use of statin, advanced cardiac care, and better public awareness. But in the last decade, that progress has slowed, and in some population, cardiovascular mortality has plateaued or even increased. The reason? We are becoming more unhealthy. Overweight and obesity affects about 80% of the U.S. population, and diabetes has followed obesity, and it doubles or triples cardiovascular risk. We know that 12% of the U.S. population adults have diabetes, and probably a third of the U.S. population is pre-diabetic. So the risk in obesity and diabetes is strongly linked to increased consumption in ultra-processed food. And to talk to us about this today, we invited an expert in the field, Dr. Amy Goss, who's associate professor at the university, actually in the nutrition field. She's at University of Alabama in Birmingham. She's a registered dietitian, and she's investigated and she's an expert in conducting randomized clinical trial to examine the effect of diet quality, micronutrient composition on the risk factors of chronic metabolic disease such as obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and type 2 diabetes. So Amy, thank you very much for taking the time and being here today at MyHeart.net.
Yes, thank you so much for having me back.
Amy, if we could start with the beginning and tell us a little bit, what are ultra-processed food and how different is it from the regular processed food?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So ultra-processed foods essentially are industrial formulations that are made with little to no whole foods. And they're often containing many additives and ingredients that are not typically found in what we would think of as like whole foods. So they're characterized by extensive industrial processing that alters them significantly from their natural state, often are engineered for taste and for long shelf life. And so it says essentially ultra-processed foods can be thought of as food products rather than, what we would consider a whole food or a minimally processed food. This is sort of based on the NOVA classifications is how we sort of classify foods based on their processing. And there are 4 different groups of these NOVA classifications. So the first classification, group 1, would be what we consider whole foods, minimally processed foods. And then ultra processed foods are in group 4. So these are the foods that, again, we consider like food products. They have additives, and they've been through extensive processing. And really, a lot of these foods, you look at them, you can't really tell what their source is because they've been through so much that they're sort of like unrecognizable as like a plant or an animal. So that's sort of like at its core what ultra processed foods are.
So basically, if I look at the label and I see a content that is not in my kitchen, it's probably not contains some ultra processing. If the food
Yes.
is packaged or boxed, likely to be processed. If a
Right.
food has maybe certain healthy claims, it's probably ultra processed and
Right.
probably doesn't hold up to its claim.
Right. That's right. So yeah, anything that's really commercially processed, we're talking some breads, cakes, cookies, donuts, cereals, things like that, even meat products that are ultra processed, things like hot dogs, and different, sort of more ready to eat convenience type foods such as frozen pizzas and soft drinks. Those would all fall into that group 4 NOVA classification of the ultra processed foods.
Good. Well, let's start with maybe the sodas, and the diet drinks. And, if you look at the label, it's got the zero fat, zero saturated, no sugar, no salt, no calories for Diet Coke. Yet, if you look at the fine label, there's some coloring, that the caramel, E150D, whatever that is, some phosphoric acid and citric acid, which dissolve your teeth and it's not good for your bones. And I love the fact that, Donald Trump, back when he was not president, used to use Twitter a lot. In 2012, he says the following. He said, "I've never seen a thin person, drinking Diet Coke." And several tweets later, he says, obviously, the Coca-Cola company was not happy with him, of course, but I don't think he cared about that. He keeps drinking it. But then he says that people are going crazy, of course, with his comments on diet sodas. And let's face it, the stuff just doesn't work. It makes you hungry. So what is the evidence that we have now that ultra-processed food really does increase, weight gain and leads to obesity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's interesting is, there's plenty of epidemiological data out there looking at associations between ultra processed foods and, different health outcomes, risk of certain disease. So, based on that data, you would think that yes, there's evidence that they're bad for you. But when we get down to it in terms of, nutrition research is so difficult to do, especially population-based studies, because the collection of information about what people eat is very difficult. There's lots of inaccuracies in the way people report what they eat, the way people perceive what they eat, and that trickles down into like the way and the data we have to base these sort of things on. But there have been some they're really well done, tightly controlled randomized clinical trials, particularly by Kevin Hall at the NIH, who he recently retired from the NIH, but he's done some of the sort of seminal work in ultra processed foods and doing these studies that are tightly controlled, that we can sort of draw some conclusions from, I think, about what ultra processed foods are doing. In this field, I think there's still so much more work that needs to be done. But Kevin Hall, he did a study was published in 2019. It's what we consider a sort of metabolic ward study. So he had people come stay at the clinical center at the NIH for, I believe it was 4 weeks total. They consumed an ultra processed food diet for 2 weeks and then a minimally processed food diet. The point of the study was they were offered this food ad libitum over the 2-week time span when they were randomized to whichever diet they started first. And what's interesting is that these two diets were matched in every way. They attempt to match on carbs, fat, protein, fiber, you name it. They tried to match these diets as closely as possible and then offered sort of an ad libitum, scenario for them to consume the food. And what they found is when people were offered the ultra processed food diet, they overconsumed. So they consumed excess energy, they gained weight in that condition. Whereas during the minimally processed food arm, they tended to lose weight. And this was a short-term study. It was 20 people. But again, this goes back to what the level of rigor that was used in doing this particular study. We can draw some sort of conclusion about, okay, processed foods, they might actually cause people to overeat if that's what they're primarily consuming. You could argue that that isn't necessarily like what the normal human diet is like in the real world. I don't think there may be some people that eat exclusively ultra processed foods, but typically people consume a combination of minimally processed, somewhat processed, and ultra processed foods, and how that affects obesity. So it may be a leap to suggest that that is some conclusive evidence about what ultra processed foods are doing. But I think it's a start in terms of showing us that it could, in fact, eating these types of foods could cause people to overeat in general and lead to greater adiposity over time.
Yeah. Well, I love that experiment. Of course, it was 100% processed food for one of those group, for 2 weeks. But we have our kids now that probably eat about 80% of the diet is ultra processed food. And
Yeah.
most US adult, it's more in the order of 50 to 60% ultra processed. And I think you're right. I mean, I think some of the data showing that it causes diabetes and heart disease is mostly, multi-center, studies, cohort studies, which are not, perfect, obviously. But,
Right.
when you look at, you kind of group them together and do, meta-analyses, you realize that, yes, I mean, I think ultra-processed food is certainly related to cardiovascular disease like stroke, heart attacks, cancers, particularly breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colon specifically. Metabolic disease, which obviously you focus a lot of your attention and research, high blood pressure, diabetes, fatty liver disease, which you're becoming an expert in, inflammatory disease, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn, irritable bowel disease, and increased risk of death overall, all cardiac mortality. So at least we have some indication linking, the ultra processed food to these type of disease. Not that we have the actual proof, but certainly some suggestion that they're related. So from the practical standpoint, though, Amy, I mean, how can we tell if the food is ultra processed when we're shopping? Is ultra processing, that means kind of industrially produced, food, is it all bad, or is there some that is actually not as bad as others?
Yeah. So I think in general, what we like to tell people is um, at the grocery store, it's it's easy to pick out the ultra processed foods if you just take a glare at the food label. If it has all these additives, if there's sugar and fat are typical, like high sugar, high fat content are pretty typical of a lot of ultra processed foods. And there are very few foods that are naturally occurring that are high in both of those. So it's like these foods are designed to be highly palatable, lots of additives. But are all ultra processed foods bad? I don't think so. I think a recent sort of comparison that I saw about this would be considering something like chickpeas. If you get dry chickpeas and cook them yourself, soak them in water, those would be considered whole foods, right? If you
Mhm.
buy them from a can and you have to drain them and rinse them, those would be considered a group 3 classification on the NOVA system, so that they are still processed. If you think about hummus, like some hummus that have like additives added to them to increase the shelf life and make them more palatable, and you find them in the grocery store, those would be considered ultra processed. So, but do we typically think of hummus as being an unhealthy food? Not necessarily. Um, so it's kind of like it may not be a one size sort of fits all type situation when we classify these foods. It doesn't, the processing itself may not be what's particularly problematic. It's the way in which those foods are interacting with our physiology that um, sort of makes them maybe increase or decrease risk of metabolic disease over time, right? And it's not just like eating ultra processed foods once or a couple of times a week. It's really a problem when it's in a part of every meal, every day, when it's, like you said, like a high percentage of your intake is coming from these types of foods, then that is probably what is most problematic for some people.
I mean, I guess that's the problem with these food. I mean, they make them soft, and it's dry. So I mean, and it's like high uh, calorie or energy, content. So you
Hmm.
really kind of like you eat this food and you never really kind of satisfied. I mean, you're always,
Right.
hungry, and you just
Yeah. I mean, the hypothesis, it's that like these foods bypass the circuitry, right? The gut brain circuitry that's telling you you're full, that those nutrient sensing pathways, they're sort of bypassing, making it easier for people to overeat. Um, Again, like there needs to be more research in this area. I think going back to Kevin Hall's work at the NIH, like he recently published a study looking at dopamine responses to ultra processed, I think it was a milkshake or something, and didn't necessarily find that it was activating the same pathways as drug addiction. Like, so it may not be the exact same mechanisms through which people become addicted to other substances, but um, that's not necessarily the entire explanation if we're thinking about why people tend to overeat ultra processed foods, because they're not engaging certain nutrient sensing pathways that whole foods might be doing.
yeah. I mean, I guess it's like if you have an apple and if you bite into it and kind of chew it, eat the whole apple the way it was meant to be eaten versus if you just kind of drink the apple juice, I
Hmm.
mean, you're more likely, to gain weight just kind of drinking the apple juice. And
Right.
it's also kind of interesting, the pathway, with the brain. I mean, certainly you have the new drugs now, well, not so new anymore, but the GLP-1 agonists where,
Hmm.
they really kind of work on the brain and makes you eat less. But they're also very good with addiction and alcohol,
Hmm.
abuse and being used for that purpose as well. So there's a certain center there in the brain that is, kind of the ultra processed food is really touching with the center of addiction, you know.
Right.
If we look
Yeah.
from the societal standpoint, Amy, why are the ultra processed foods so cheap and convenient compared to fresh food? And are the food companies actually deliberately making this food addictive? Is it all for the money?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think part of the reason why it's so cheap and easy, it comes down to a shelf life issue, right? These foods can sit on the shelf for months, if not years, and not go bad. They're, you know, fresh food. You have to either sell it or throw it out.
Hmm.
Um, and it takes refrigeration to ship, you know, whole foods and produce, whereas it doesn't require that much effort. It doesn't require refrigeration to get certain ultra processed foods on the shelves at the grocery stores. So I think, and they're cheaper to make, right? It's just it does boil down to money. And and thinking about these companies that make these types of foods, I often think about like I don't think their intention was to make people sick. But we do live in a capitalistic society, right? And they're trying to make the most palatable product and turn over that product. So they're making something that people like to eat that tastes good, So, um, was their intention to, start an epidemic of obesity and diabetes? I would be surprised if it were truly that evil,
Right.
but there are unintended consequences to things like this. So.
I mean, you see, I know you do a lot of studies in families and children, and you're quite involved actually with children. Do you see, ultra processed food actually affecting, our kids, our families, our communities?
Yes, absolutely. It's particularly profound in the kids, I think, that we work with in our studies, where we see children that are not even 10 years old yet that have extremely high liver fat. They're on a path to end up with type 2 diabetes and cirrhosis at a young age if something's not done, if there's no intervention early on. So, we see firsthand we have some really sick kids on our hands, that's related to diet and these sorts of things. So it's something very serious. And I think, thinking really, um, trying to bring some innovation and bring some creativity and bring some compassion to these kids and understanding how, as researchers, we can better understand like the barriers to getting and consuming healthier foods that are more nutritious, this goes ever from, even from the foods that are being provided in school systems to what parents are providing at home. Like, how can we effectively intervene and make these foods more palatable? Like, how do we teach people to cook in a way that's palatable to kids? How do we introduce the foods? Something we've learned in our studies is, our dietitians create these really outstanding like vegetable dishes and things for the parents to cook, and we often get feedback. They're just like, oh wow, we didn't know that we liked this type of food. We didn't know we could cook it like this and it's healthy for us. And it's just, there's a learning curve, I think. People just can be intimidated by the thought of cooking certain things and not knowing if their kids will like it or if it tastes good. So anyway, I could talk on and on about that, but I think
Well, I think you could give us some tips. For example, I mean, it's impossible to avoid completely, I think, ultra processing, in the food that
right.
we eat. But, particularly, how can low income or busy families, reduce the intake of ultra processed, food without breaking the bank or having to cook all
Yeah.
day? So, can you give us some tips? What do you do? How do you
You
teach
know,
your families and
yeah, I think it's like I said, like figuring out what different types of foods that you can make with minimal number of ingredients that are good to you, falling back on those recipes that are made primarily from whole foods. And even when I say that, like if we're thinking about like produce or fruits and vegetables, canned and frozen vegetables or in foods, or particularly vegetables, have the same like nutrient density as a fresh. So like choosing like frozen broccoli versus fresh broccoli, like that's okay. It's going to be cheaper. Um, Canned is a little trickier because of the sodium content, and they do add some things. But I think there are ways of figuring out, menu planning, um, and things like that that can be budget friendly. Um, Obviously, another layer to this is having the time, right? If you're working full time, um, do you have the time? Do you have the resources? Those are all like things that need to be addressed if we want to get our kids and families healthier too. So it's complicated when both parents work and maybe multiple jobs too. And it's finding that time to cook together as a family, sit down and together and eat as a family. Things like that can be very challenging. So making sure to just acknowledge that piece of it too, that you've got to figure out ways. Registered dietitians are excellently trained to work with families in this way and figure out budget friendly, cost effective, um, quick meals that they can put together that are more nutritious than solely relying on ultra processed convenience foods for their nutrition.
Mhm. I know you do a lot of research in the ketogenic diet,
Hmm.
and we're talking about ultra processing. Could you give us maybe just an example of a typical day that you feed, your families, like for breakfast, what do you serve them? For lunch, what do you serve them? And for dinner, what do you serve them? That doesn't take like a whole day to cook, and actually they can really kind of help with their weight or their abdominal obesity or their fatty liver. Mm.
Yeah, sure. So, in our largest study right now, that where it's not necessarily ketogenic diet, it's lower in carbohydrate. I call it a moderately carbohydrate restricted diet. So the kids are getting anywhere, it depends on their energy needs, but it's typically a range of carbohydrate from like 90 to 120, 150 grams per day. That may or may not elevate their ketones at that level.
Mm.
It wasn't designed intentionally to be a ketogenic diet, but really just minimal processed foods. The control diet is lower in fat, but it's also, we intended it to be minimal processed foods strictly so we could see if it's truly the macronutrient distribution that's affecting the liver fat
Mhm.
in those families. But so a typical day for our lower carbohydrate would be something like an egg sort of based breakfast. So, think like maybe an omelet or scrambled eggs with a vegetable, or, we kind of encourage them to try to get vegetables in with each meal as well. So like a veggie omelet or something for breakfast. We also have recipes like that can be made ahead and frozen, like their egg muffins and things like that. That it's kind of like a little like egg quiche for breakfast.
Mhm.
Lunch is typically, sometimes we use different types of really high fiber pitas or wraps for our low carb kids. So like a Joseph's pita is one brand in particular that's high in fiber and like really low in carb. So they'll have like a chicken salad pita with some like a side of veggies or something like that. And then dinner could be like sauteed squash with salmon and another vegetable as a side. And we include some like high fiber fruits and things like that as snacks, cheese sticks, carrots and ranch, things like that for snacks. So we're really encouraging that that's maybe like a standard day. And I think the dietitians that work with our study are much more creative than what I just probably rattled off in that one menu.
Well, I
But
don't know. It's making
that's
me
sort of
hungry.
like an example.
It's making me hungry. But I like the way you're kind of swapping, for snacks, kind of the fruit or some vegetables like the carrots. How about cereal? I mean, do you actually kind of feed them cereal?
We don't. We try to
No,
stay
don't.
away from cereal. I
Anything in
think
the
on
box,
both diets, there may be some cereal on our low fat diet arm, but
right? And
but
no
yeah,
oatmeal,
we
no
have
oatmeal either, right? So basically, can I be healthy and eat a little bit of ultra processed food?
I think the answer is yes. Something like I'd say it's not something I would say you can never eat again and not be healthy, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Um, every now and again, yeah, like I think it's fine to have, go to the ballpark and have a hot dog or,
Yeah.
um,
And I'm thinking of
things like
July 4th coming up.
exactly, July 4th.
You
Have
make
your
a
cake
special
on your
occasion.
birthday.
Right.
But it's really about what you're doing during like your routine, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's the day in day out habits that we form, I think, that are so important, and the pattern, right? Like the overall dietary pattern, like understanding that these things are okay on like special occasions and maybe not just like every single meal that we're eating.
Mhm.
Um, I think is important. It's kind of like never not thinking of food in like a black and white or a very binary way, like good versus bad. It's like in general, this is the dietary pattern matters. These things can be included, every once in a while, and you're going to be fine. You can live your life metabolic, in good metabolic health.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely. Well, Amy, listen, I want to thank you very much. I mean, it's such a wealth of knowledge and, it's such an important topic, about nutrition. And we know so little. I know I'm a cardiologist and we never had any teaching or much teaching like that in medical school.
yeah,
Hopefully it's changing now, but also it's about, helping our patients, what we recommend them and certainly cutting down on ultra processed food certainly can help. And maybe we could reverse, this trend in increase in metabolic syndrome and obesity, and maybe
hmm
we could make a dent, a little by little and by education, and
right,
awareness.
yeah,
Amy
absolutely.
Goss, associate
That's okay.
professor, in the field of nutrition at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I don't know how much to thank you. And maybe we could catch up maybe later. We'll talk about this fatty liver, that is
Yes, would
becoming
love
such a
to.
problem, and central or abdominal obesity.
Yep.
Thank you, Amy. Have a great day.
To learn more from our team of cardiologists, please visit us at MyHeart.net. You can also follow us on social media by searching MyHeart.net on Facebook and Twitter. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss our next episode.